Tell me, where did the inspiration for this book come from?
It's an interesting history. It goes back to the 1990s when I was doing some work on ICI, which, as you know, was for most of the 20th century Britain's largest and successful industrial company. And the history of ICI was one in which the company had begun from specialization in dyestuffs and chemicals, had moved to petrochemicals and agrochemicals when that became a more interesting line of business. And then in the 1940s, after the Second World War, the senior executives of ICI took the, as it turned out, rather far-sighted view that the future of applying chemistry to business lay in pharmaceuticals, and set up a pharmaceutical division. Now, that pharmaceutical division lost money for the company for 20 years. And that was instructive, because I think very few companies with the kind of financial pressures that the market now places on companies would be able to do that kind of thing. But in the end, the pharmaceutical division of ICI became by far the most valuable part of the whole company. Now, the pharmaceutical division took off when in the 1960s a group of chemists in ICI led by James Black discovered beta blockers, which were the first effective drugs against hypertension. But interestingly, after that discovery, Black left ICI and he went and joined another British drug company at the time, SmithKline French, where he discovered another blockbuster drug, quite a different one, called an anti-ulcerant drug called Tagamet. That was actually the first drug to be of any use in that area. And then, actually, as a result of Black's discovery there, a third British company called Glaxo, which was a small, struggling pharmaceutical company at the time, refocused its research program and came up with a somewhat imitative drug for Tagamet, which did much the same job but rather better. And Zantac, which they created, actually became, for a time, the best-selling drug in the history of pharmaceuticals. Now, so in a sense, Black's discoveries were the foundation of the British pharmaceutical industry, which in many respects is the most successful British industry since the Second World War. But I was interested in the question, why did Black actually leave ICI? And I went to talk to him about it, and he said, well, it's easy enough. Management of ICI wanted me to go on road shows to sell Tagamet, whereas to sell beta blockers, whereas what I actually wanted to do was discover new drugs. So I went to a company that let me do that. And then he looked at me and laughed and said, you know, I think I used to tell my colleagues in ICI that if they wanted to make money, there were many easier ways of doing it than pharmaceutical research. And he shook his head and said, how wrong could I have been? And he finished by saying, I think of it as the principle of obliquity, that very often complex goals are best achieved by not pursuing them directly. And that exchange and that example, you know, stuck in my mind, you know, ever since. And that's why I titled, you know, this book Obliquity, and why I've been thinking about examples in other ways. And there's a really important lesson for business generally in all of that, which is that the most profitable companies are not necessarily the most profit-oriented, because actually the success of pharmaceutical research depends entirely, in fact, on having people like Black come up with these discoveries. And what the more profit-oriented management had failed to do was to give the sense of purpose that actually achieved that result. And that's what a number of people have called the kind of profit-seeking paradox, that the way to become profitable is not necessarily to be the most aggressive in pursuit of profits. Bear Stearns, as we know, had this famous sign on the trading floor saying, "We make nothing but money." And in the end, they finished up not making that.
Yeah. Well, John, I don't know what we say, follow on the next stage of the book, or what kind of title is in your imagination right now. But I think this is a very thought-provoking concept that you've brought to bear, and certainly good, what you might call anti-hubris inoculation for economists. And I want to thank you for joining us here today.
Good. Thanks, Rob.